I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the BMW 530e plug-in hybrid. The 530e is a 5 Series BMW for a very particular type of person. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is this is the 5 Series to buy if you really want BMW's mid-size sedan, you're interested in lowering your personal carbon footprint, you like the idea of driving around the city in electric mode with zero emissions, and you have a garage at home that you want to install an EV charging wall box to, or you have something similar at the office on the other end of your commute. And if you're already thinking, wow, that must apply to tens of people here in Australia, you're possibly right, because the 530e is a pretty niche 5 Series. You don't see too many of them on the road, but in today's video, I'm going to explain exactly why, if you are a person that fits that criteria, this car actually can make a lot of sense. But on the flip side, I'm also going to explain why, if you're not all that interested in that stuff, or if your round trip commute is more than like 40 Ks, then you're probably going to be more interested in the 530d 6-cylinder diesel or the M550i V8 petrol, which are in some ways a little more interesting to drive than this particular vehicle. But we'll do our usual thing. We'll jump inside, then we'll talk about the running costs for this vehicle, which can be extremely low, and then we'll head out onto the road in the 530e to see what its dynamics are actually like. Before we get started, make sure to hit subscribe. Here in the cabin of the 530e, you really see how BMW elevates the 5 Series above the 3 Series. And I think that's an interesting point to quickly make, because the running gear of the 530e is exactly the same as what you get on the 330e, which I gave really quite a positive review to here on Chasing Cars a few months ago. Now the 330e is $40,000 cheaper than this car. It's still a sedan, it's still roomy, and it's quicker and lighter by virtue of being a 3 Series. But you do see some difference here in the cabin, where the 530e presents as closer to a 7 Series, I would say. It's really quite plush, particularly outfitted like this particular car, which has the Napa comfort seats in this gorgeous black diamond finished pattern. These feel like something properly special. They've got heaps of electric adjustment on both sides here up front. We've got heating front and rear with these seats. They do feel like a quality item. Similarly, we've got a lovely soft leather steering wheel, still that really thick rim that BMW are loving at the minute, but we've got this stitched hub. We've got big paddle shifters for the 8-speed ZF automatic gearbox that I'll talk about when we take this car for a drive. And while this car has a dark and relatively conservative interior, we do have this attractive fine wood trim, which really, just is subtle, traditional, but it looks really good. What's less traditional is the infotainment, which is excellent, probably best in class. We have this big 12-inch touchscreen here, which came along with the facelift to the G35 series, but we still have the iDrive controller down here, which is great. BMW were one of the first to introduce wireless Apple CarPlay, which this car does have, and it's much more reliable than wireless CarPlay from some other manufacturers. Then we have a screen in front of us, fully digital. Unfortunately, BMW don't exploit the capabilities of this screen as much as Audi do in the A6. There is a map, but unfortunately there's no street names or anything particularly useful for identifying your location, but it's crisp, it's clear, the graphics on the screen do look pretty cool. Harman Kardon audio sounds really great in this car. As I mentioned, the material quality is excellent, though at just under $150,000 drive away, I do have to wonder whether or not these doors and dash trims should be leather. I mean, come on. You can option that, but it's like another grand or two, right? Just throw it in at this price, surely. In terms of practicality, we've got a dual armrest here with lots of space. We've got wireless charging, decent cup holders, decent door bins, and a further optional sunroof here above me. So up front, it's plush, it feels expensive and special. Let's check out the back seat. The back seat of the 5 Series does pay some dividends of the fact that this car is pretty long and has quite a long wheelbase. While the front seats optioned to this vehicle are the frankly massive comfort seats, we still have adequate space here in the back for adults. For myself at 6 foot, headroom is okay, legroom's good, toe room's good. Now the middle seat, it's a perch and there is a big transmission tunnel running through here, but as a vehicle to transport 4 adults in comfort, the 5 Series is impressive. Plus, we've got air vents, we've got fast charging USB-C ports, we've got, well, we have a 40-20-40 folding backrest, but we also have an armrest with cup holders. Plus, the rear bench itself is inclined upwards, it's comfortable and soft, as are the materials used back here. So if you're going away for the weekend with some friends to some wineries or something like that, this is going to be really lovely. Heading around here to the back of this facelift 530e, we can take in this quite pleasant Bernina amber paint color. It looks like flat gray. It may come up as flat gray on camera, I'm not sure. But in the sunlight, and when you get close to it, you see it does have this really nice amber fleck. It was actually the communication color for the facelift 7 Series, so it's quite nice to see it here on this 5 Series. We do have a power tailgate for the boot, which opens up to reveal actually quite a constricted amount of boot space. You see I've got rather forlornly the Chasing Cars cabin suitcase next to me because it doesn't fit into the boot, which is just 410 litres due to the additional space taken up by the battery and also the storage for the charging cable. So we can only get the 2 suitcases here, the big and the medium size, into the back. Unfortunately, BMW discontinued the station wagon or touring version of the 5 Series just when this facelift came into the country. So unless you're a highway patrol officer in Victoria, sadly you don't get to enjoy this car with additional practicality and better styling outside as far as I'm concerned. But, you know, if you also have an SUV parked next to this in the garage, which I think for quite a few customers that probably is the case, then at the end of the day, it doesn't have to be immensely practical, but for such a large and long car, you would hope for a bit more cargo space, wouldn't you? The last step before we take a drive in the 530e is to talk about the running costs of this car. And that's where it gets really interesting when we have a plug-in hybrid to review, because the running costs can either be pretty ordinary for a BMW 5 Series, or they can be very, very low if you actually are going to lean into what this car is all about and charge it, you know, pretty much every day or overnight. So let's talk about the charging and fuel consumption situation first. This vehicle has a 12 kilowatt hour battery, which gives it a real world range of 40 kilometers in our testing. Now the WLTP claim for this car is actually 54 Ks, so it's fallen some way short in our testing and also in the testing of some other people too. So that means that the efficiency is around 30 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers, which is pretty inefficient. But that's quite typical for a plug-in hybrid. They're not anywhere near as efficient as a full EV because they have to lug around that petrol engine no matter what. However, recharging the 530e at home would cost you about $3 here in New South Wales, or if you have household solar, it could be free. So if you're driving Monday to Friday, for example, is just heading into the office, parking up for the day and heading back home, you could theoretically do all of that driving at very, very low cost and not even have to use a drop of petrol. And then at the weekend, you can use this vehicle's, you know, hidden talent, which is the fact that under the bonnet, it's basically a 520i petrol. You've got the range of a 49 litre petrol tank that can take you out into the countryside, regardless of whether you're using electric juice or not. And when you're using the vehicle with just the petrol engine, the fuel economy is still pretty good, around that 7.5 litre per 100k mark, because just like a Toyota or a Lexus hybrid, it does use little bursts of electric juice as much as it can. Now, servicing, the cheapest way to service the 530e is to buy an upfront servicing plan when you purchase the car from BMW, and a basic package for 5 years or 80,000 kilometers of maintenance costs $1,950, which is actually very cheap for this segment of vehicle. Unfortunately, the warranty on the car is just 3 years, which pales in comparison to the Mercedes-Benz warranty of 5 years. As with any electrified vehicle, a big question about the 530e comes down to how you're going to charge the vehicle. And really, this car will fit in with your lifestyle if you're able to park it in a garage at home and plug it into a power point, even just a standard Australian power point, to charge it, because there's actually very little benefit that comes from pumping up your infrastructure at home with a true EV wall box. And that's because the maximum charging speed of this car is only just above 3 kilowatts. That's what it's limited to. So unfortunately, unlike plug-in hybrids like the new Mercedes A250e, you can't even option DC fast charging onto the 530e. So, you know, we have this relatively small battery, 12 kilowatt hours, Plugging it into the wall will yield you around 2 kilowatts of power here in Australia, just into a standard socket. So that's going to take around 6 hours to charge up the car. With the benefit of an EV wall box, you'll only manage to get that down to around 4 hours. However, if you use the 530e like BMW expects people to, charging it up overnight or between errands, if you're home during the middle of the day, then you'll be able to keep this battery topped up to around 40 Ks of real range no matter what. And that's exactly how the 530e is meant to be used. On electric power for your commute, and then with the petrol engine for trips further afield. So it's a relatively, I guess, niche setup, but you can imagine that in future years, as purchasing EVs and PHEVs is incentivized more and more strongly through the Australian tax system, certainly that will be the case here in New South Wales, vehicles like the 530e that give you electric range in town and a combustion motor for longer trips are going to become popular for at least a few years. So how does the tech work here in the 530e? Well, to be honest with you, it's pretty convincing. It's almost as if BMW have been making hybrids for years, and they have. It's just that we haven't seen many of them on the road here in Australia. Here in Australia, hybrid is synonymous with Toyota and Lexus, but their vehicles aren't generally plug-in hybrids. They are in some markets, but typically here in Australia, you just drive them and the system figures out when to use the petrol engine and when to use the electric motor and the very small battery. It's a slightly different setup here in the 530e, where you only extract the best efficiency from this car if you actually do plug it in with regularity. If you drive it around with no juice in the battery, it still functions much like a series parallel hybrid. It'll still cruise around on electric power with what it manages to regenerate when you brake. But ultimately, that's not very much of the time. It's not really optimized to be driven that way. And if you do drive it that way, the economy of around 8 litres per 100 Ks is good for a car that's this big, but nowhere near as good as something like a Lexus ES 300h, which is a hybrid that's optimized to be driven without being plugged in. In the 5 Series, however, the consumption story is more complicated, and it really comes down to your use case. If you are that perfect example of someone who plugs the car in overnight, has a commute of less than 40 Ks round trip, then you're just going to use electric power during the week with this car, and then you can do road trips or whatever and tap into the petrol engine and get those figures of 7 or 8 litres per 100 Ks on the open road. However, if you charge up the battery and you need to do, say, 100 Ks, then you're going to use up all the battery in about 40 Ks, or a little bit longer if you kind of use hybrid mode and the engine comes in and out. Whereas over that 100 kilometers, your fuel economy is going to be closer to sort of 2 or 3 litres per 100, because it's bringing in that electric juice into the calculation. But if you never plug the car in, you're just going to get middling fuel economy at best. So if you're going to bother to spend the money to buy a plug-in hybrid, you've got to plug it in. That's kind of the moral of the story. But if you do all that, then the experience is fairly seamless. It drives nicely on electric power, not fast though, and that's because we've only got 83 kilowatts of power and 230 Newton meters of torque. So when you're driving the 530e on electric power alone, it's basically like you're driving a Volkswagen Polo if it was electric, because those power and torque numbers are modest. It doesn't feel as bad because the torque does come on, instantly, as an EV does. But if you're driving up a hill, you need to be quite gentle on the throttle, or else it will bring the petrol engine into play. Now, speaking of that petrol engine, the car is basically a 520i. So we've got a 2-litre turbo petrol 4-cylinder with 135 kilowatts of power. And then when it combines with the electric motor, if they're both being brought into the fold, then the car generates some impressive top line numbers of 215 kilowatts of power and 420 Newton meters of torque. But there aren't many circumstances where both of them are contributing that way. So you're usually either driving through the petrol engine with a little bit of electric boost, or through the electric engine alone. So you kind of have to test drive it to see whether that's going to fit into your lifestyle. For me, I think that it's probably worth waiting for the new BMW i4 if you want a fully electric BMW about this size, a little bit smaller, but about this size. Or alternatively, if you don't really care about the electric bits and bobs on this car, then I would just take the opportunity to spend a tiny bit more and buy an M550i V8. Of course, the carbon impact on the planet is rather different with that vehicle, and I'll leave that up to you to make a judgment call on those factors. But ultimately, the 530e feels pretty compromised. It does come together really well out on the road, but you know, it's neither the best electric BMW nor the best combustion BMW. It kind of takes bits of both, and it doesn't add up to more than the sum of its parts. It's just the sum of its parts, I guess. Probably sounds like I'm a bit tepid on it, because I am. I think the 330e is better. It's lighter, it's quicker as a result. The 530e is a pretty big car, and both the outputs of the petrol engine and the electric motor are nothing electrifying. But the ride and handling is nice. It's a comfortable car. Even on these big 20s, it still rides really well. You do catch some sharp edges of bumps though, which kind of shudder the chassis a little bit. I'd probably stick to slightly smaller wheels, but you know, it's composed, it's balanced, it's compliant most of the time. And then it does shrink around you when you find a good road. You know, it's still a sports sedan, this 5 Series, even if it's probably a bit more opulent than previous generations. The steering is, you know, it's relaxingly tuned. It's not too fast or too slow, but it does have an intuitive sort of feeling to it. The car's refined, it's quiet, and the safety systems are tuned very well. So we've got lane keep assist, which really is bang in the center of the lane, the assisted driving function. We've got adaptive cruise, we've got AEB, blind spot monitoring, a really good 360-degree camera. So the car is high technology. It certainly doesn't let you down. The question is merely whether or not this is the right fit for you. And if it is, it certainly works well. I would just also consider the much cheaper and lighter 330e, and I would consider the upcoming BMW i4, which is fully electric. But you can let me know your thoughts down below the video. So those are my impressions of the BMW 530e plug-in hybrid. Hopefully this video made clear that if you want a BMW 5 Series, you're interested in zero emissions motoring, and you're actually going to charge this vehicle, then the 530e can make a lot of sense. However, if you just want a 5 Series and you're not sure whether you care enough to plug it in and charge it with regularity, it doesn't make sense. And one of the other specifications of this car, be it a 4-cylinder petrol, a 6-cylinder diesel, or a V8 petrol, will probably suit you better. And frankly, while you still can buy those passionate sorts of 5 Series, you might be more taken by them regardless. But I'm keen to know your view. Let me know down below this video. While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.